Assalamualaikum everyone. So far we have discussed many topics in our in-person classes. For today, we'll again be discussing the state of Israel or creation of the state of Israel and its impact on the Arab world. The Middle East, if seen as a whole, we can say that it has a high population of Muslims. But Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of these three Abrahamic religions emerged in the Middle East. In fact, after World War II, a conflict involving Jews was the major political event in the Middle East. Then, if you remember, I had shared with you a video about the Christian Zionist movement. And the history of religion, the geography of faith, and its war across history. It was a map of wars, and it shows that how wars were fought in the name of religion, one religion, or the faith followers of one faith would get engaged in war with the other one. After World War I, we can say that most of the area in the Middle East came under the mandate system, and the mandates and the states having mandate over different countries in the Middle East mostly were from Europe. So in the same way, Palestine came under the British. It became the British mandate. And this conflict over Palestine, started since Roman times. If we go back to the history, it was not that, it started soon after, the World War One or during World War One or in the interwar period. But it has a history of, having different kinds of wars and conflicts. So since Roman times, Jews had, dreamed of returning to Palestine, a land which they called as Israel. And if you remember in our previous classes, we had discussed that how these war in the history had resulted in the Jewish diaspora, how they started settling in other parts of the world when first the Palestine, or the area that was consisted of Palestine, came under the rule of Muslims, later on under the Christians, and then later on under the Muslim control. So from that time onwards, the Jews started leaving Jerusalem and settled in other parts of the world, and mostly were settled in Europe. During World War I, the Allies made, vague promises of supporting the idea of setting up a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Yet non-Jewish communities already existed in Palestine. First we can say that Muslims were settled there, or Arab communities were there, although most Arabs were Muslims and some were Christians. So both Jews and Palestinian Arabs claimed a historical right to this land, and that again we had discussed that how important this land is for the three Abrahamic religions. It has religious importance for them, it has historical importance for them as well. So Jewish migration to Palestine, which began in the late 1800s, increased after World War II or after the Holocaust, and this created tension between Jews and Palestinian Arabs. After 1945, Jews and the Palestinian Arabs wanted individual nations, and both felt they had claim to Palestine. I mean, the Palestinian Arabs were not in favor of dividing the states into two states. And so was the case with Jews who started settling in Palestine. But the major powers of the time, they were engaged in talks and dialogue with both, with all the stakeholders. And it was initially promised to the Palestinian people that there would be a two-state solution to the area where Palestinian would be living in their own country, and a state would be created for the Jewish population. Again, if we see that when this Palestine was under the British mandate, after the First World War, Britain withdrew in 1948, and the United States at that time proposed that the country be partitioned into two. And at the same time, the UN drew up a plan to separate Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state. So, I mean, the state was, divided in a way that almost 50% of the area would belong to the Palestinian Arabs, created as a state of Palestine, and the 50% would be created as the state of Israel. And that was the start of Arab-Israel conflict, because we have been, discussing during our in-person classes that how this whole matter was, discussed in the United Nations, where again it was decided that there would be two-state solution to the issue. However, in the end, the Muslim world came to know that a state of Israel was created, and it was pledged during that discussion that the non-Jewish population would be given their due rights, because Jews who had suffered after the Holocaust, I mean, many Jews believed that they should have a homeland. So since it had religious importance for them as well, they concentrated on the biblical area of Israel and its capital, Jerusalem. And Israel include holy places for the Jewish religion and is surrounded by the Muslim countries. So, from the very beginning, Jews were, vying for a state of their own. The United Nations agreed that the Jewish people of the world should be given a land so they could live together in peace. Yet, at that time, Palestinian Muslims lived on the land that the United Nations gave to the Jewish people. So it was very obvious that a reaction would soon be shown by the Arab countries. The Palestinians and the neighbor Arabic nations did not accept the creation of Israel. So that resulted in the first war, Arab-Israel War. The war broke out when the Jews, certain of the US and the Soviet support, they declared their independence and the creation of Israel in 1945. Or one thing that we should remember is that this was the time when the superpowers were trying to secure Middle Eastern nations and as their new allies. You might have discussed this during many courses of IR, that how the world was dominated by European states. Major powers in Europe were having a say in international politics. It was the same case after World War I, but after the World War II, when a new world order was set up and a Cold War started between United States and Soviet Union, many of the states at that time allied themselves with one bloc or the other bloc. So both these blocs were trying to have a say or to have influence in different regions of the world. And Middle East, because of its geopolitical and geoeconomic importance, was on the top of the superpowers agenda. So United States wanted, along with its allies, wanted to secure Middle Eastern nations as their new allies. But this creation of Israel, in a way created some kind of a rift between the Arab states and the Western world. Arab states launched a military attack on Israel with the hope to, annihilate the new Jewish state. And the armies of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq together, they invaded Israel. And this was how, in 1948, the first Arab-Israel War started. Now, in 1949, the war came to an end. Israelis conquered more territory than the UN plan initially stated, and the rest of the territory fell to Egypt and Jordan rather than forming an independent Palestinian state. So it was kind of a loss for the Palestinian people, because at the end of the day, they could not achieve anything out of the first Arab-Israel War. Israel was able to capture more areas than actually, it was planned at the UN platform. And the two other countries that benefit from that war were Egypt and Jordan. An independent Palestine dream, Palestinian state dream could not be fulfilled. The Arab-Israel War of 1948 uprooted almost 700,000 Arabs from Palestine, and these refugees, they became refugees fleeing to Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza Strip. In this situation, the UN set up temporary shelters for Palestinian refugees, which have since become permanent homes. And generations of Palestinian refugees have grown up. They are determined to win a homeland of their own. After 1948 war, the number of Palestinians in a refugee camp further grew. Many supported the Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat. And the stated goal of the Palestinian Liberation Organization was the destruction of Israel, which the PLO claimed had no right to exist on the land they called Palestine. Then in 1988, the PLO also declared the independence of Palestine, that is the West Bank and Gaza. And but the conflict still continues. So, going back to Arab-Israel conflict, after the 1948 war, Israel and its Arab neighbors fought again in 1956, in 1967, which was commonly called, called as the Six-Day War, then 1973. In all these conflicts, Israel defeated Arab attacks and gained more territory for itself. In between the wars, Israel faced guerrilla warfare and terrorist activities, as the Western world would call those activities. But despite the long conflict, the UN, the United States, and others kept pushing for peace negotiations, but no, positive outcome has, been seen out of all those negotiations till date. The Six-Day War, or the June 1967 war, was such that it, there were Soviet tanks and aircrafts. The Arabs felt ready for, early 1967 to confront Israel. And there was a lot of talk and threats exchanged between the Arab states and Israel. So in June 1967, Israel attacked Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. And basically, these were the countries that Israel initially felt threatened of. And if you see at present, three of the four countries are, civil war trodden. There are, conflicts in area. There are sectarian issues in those countries. So in a way, Israel, along with its ally, was able to, make these states more weaker, because these were the states that initially, were supported by other Arab states against Israel. So in 6 days, the war was over and Israel once again won the war. And the price for peace was the annexation of Israel of Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It got Golan Heights from Syria, and from Jordan, it got West Bank. So Israel also occupied Jerusalem, which formerly was divided between Israel and Jordan. But now, it had control over whole of the Jerusalem area. Jerusalem, as I told you, is considered holy to Jewish people, and this is where their most important religious and historical sites are located. So the newly obtained lands were a huge success for Israel, but they had one problem. The population there living there was predominantly Palestinian. So in the present scenario, if we see there's this conflict going on between the Palestinian that are living inside Israel and the Israeli government. And most of the time, the government of Israel and its allies would blame the many of the Muslim states, Arab states, of supporting Palestinians that are living in Israel against the government of Israel, the state of Israel. In that six-day war, about 800 Israelis and 21,000 Arabs from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were killed. The 1967 war between Israel and its Arab neighbors lasted less than a week, but its repercussions are felt even today. And let me share this map with you. Let me check if I can share this map with you. Can you see this map? Can you see this map? Please, someone unmute your mics and let me know. Okay. So if you see, the white area in this map is Israel in 1949. The light gray is the area Israel occupied after Six-Day War of 1967, but withdrew from between 1975 and 1982. So this is the area basically that came under the Israeli control. And the yellow area was occupied after the Six-Day War and still is under the control of Israel. That was Gaza Strip and Jerusalem, Jericho, Hebron, and West Bank. These areas are still under the control of Israel. The gray areas included, the Sinai Peninsula that came under the Israeli control after Six-Day War in 1967, but by 1975 it withdrew it withdrew from some of the areas between 1975 and 1982. And And the 1973 war was fought in October, and it is known as the Yom Kippur War. This was the fourth Arab-Israel conflict. The new leader of Egypt at that time was Anwar Sadat, and he, along with Arab countries, attacked or planned to attack Israel during, the Jewish holidays, which were known as Yom Kippur, and that is why it is called as the Yom Kippur War. And this time the Israelis were caught by surprise because Arab forces killed many Israelis and recaptured some of the territories that the Arab states had lost in the 1967 war. But with massive US support and help, the Israeli were able to succeed in launching a counterattack, and it recovered most of the territory that it had lost. So both sides then agreed to an uneasy truce after several weeks of fighting. The next armed conflict erupted in 1980 when Israel decided to invade Lebanon to push Palestinian out of there, who had formed an organization which we just discussed, that was called as Palestine Liberation Organization. The Yom Kippur War then ended with partial success for Israel. It was a semi-victory because of the PLO forces were defeated but not destroyed. So in a way, it was, a 50-50 or win-win situation for both sides. Then in 1979, Egypt under President Sadat, on the insistence or pressure by the US, agreed in Camp David to sign the Camp David Accord with Israel. So in 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty with the US President Jimmy Carter as mediator at the Camp David. And it was decided that Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for its recognition. That is that one of the Arab states, major Arab state in the Middle East, would recognize as Israel as a sovereign state in return for the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Now, this whole scenario was viewed differently by Palestinian and by the Israelis. Palestinian felt that feel that they are not a free people because Israeli soldiers stopped them at checkpoints between cities. Many Palestinian, therefore must get Israeli approval each day to go to work and return home, go to hospital, get groceries, or visit their own families. And after any terrorist attacks, soldiers, sometimes refuse to let Palestinians through the checkpoints to get to work or other essential places, and that further infuriate Palestinians. Moreover, Israeli control much of the Palestinian water supply, and sadly they give less access to water to Palestinians. than they needed. So Palestinians feel humiliated and abused by the Israelis. And another issue causing Palestinians great anger is that Israel have continued to build settlement in Palestinian territory, illegally converting even more Palestinian territory into Israeli territory. So Palestinians see the settlement as a sign that Israelis do not want peace. How does Israel view this whole scenario? Um, as I just said, that any mishap in Israel is termed as an act of terrorism by Palestinian people. So Israel view Palestinian as terrorists who do not want to compromise to gain peace, who will not compromise to gain peace. Palestinian extremists, or according to them, terrorists, have in fact engaged in acts against Israel in response to Israeli government, the state decision against the Palestinians. Their acts against Israeli government when peace negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians seemed to be moving forward fairly. So this is how Israel was feeling about or viewing Palestinian as a militant, that they do not want peace, and whenever they were approaching a peace deal, they were moving forward fairly. These Palestinian would make a terrorist against Israel to stop the peace negotiations. Now, Palestinian attacks, as viewed by Israeli government or Israeli people, at key times, moderate Israeli leaders have been replaced by more extreme Israeli leaders who do not want to compromise. And that is because of Palestinian attacks against Israel. Israeli leaders, they do not trust Palestinian leaders to negotiate peace, and they do not feel safe enough to reduce their control of Palestinian territories. So this is a worldview, or this is how they are projecting their side of the story, that they would not, leave these areas because they are fearing that these Israelis would again engage in act of terror. In more recent years, the Palestinian, elected a Hamas government, and it was termed by the US government as a terrorist organization by Israel as well, and many other nations. And they believe that Hamas wanted to destroy Israel, and the Israeli government does not consider Israel safe with Hamas ruling the Palestinian, and so on and so forth. So I think this is enough for today. Tomorrow we'll continue from here. If there are any questions, I would be happy to respond to them.